to Hugh Carlton Green of BBC fame, and I got to Warsaw, and he said, one of us has got to go to the frontier, and I was on the German-Polish frontier when the German hordes, tanks, moved in.
Donald Trump will become the next president of the United States in 10 days' time. On Tuesday, the team he has picked to help him govern came under the spotlight. That's as Republicans and Democrats clashed over his picks for the cabinet in confirmation hearings by the US Senate. Now, Trump's choice for Attorney General is this man, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions. He's the first to be put through his paces. He is regarded as staunchly conservative, and he says he's been misjudged because he's from Alabama. Now, throughout his career, he has been accused of racism, but at the hearing, he repeated his assertions that he doesn't harbour race-based discrimination. Also, Mr. Sessions opposed amnesty for undocumented immigrants and was an early supporter of Donald Trump's call to build a wall along that border with Mexico. From the beginning, the hearing was interrupted several times by anti-Trump protesters, demonstrators dressed as members of the Ku Klux Klan.
I also want to thank my dear friends. USA.
Barbara Plitt-Usher is in Washington, D.C. for us and has been watching the proceedings. So, Barbara, good to have you with us. When it began, really, those previous controversies followed Senator Sessions into the confirmation hearing room.
Yes, well, as you can see there, Nuala, it's been a very contentious session. His ultra-conservative positions have many people worried about whether he's going to protect gay rights, women's rights, minority rights. The leading Democratic senator on the committee said it had received thousands of opposition letters, people who were worried that he wouldn't uphold the law fairly when it came to these groups. And then again, as you saw from the KKK protesters, or you saw from the protesters there was a particular concern about Mr. Sessions' civil rights record and allegations of racism, as well as the allegations that he supported the KKK in the past. But these are things that he firmly denied.
The complaints about the Klan case that I vigorously prosecuted and supported are false. And I do hope this hearing today will show that I conducted myself honorably and properly at that time, and that I am the same person, perhaps wiser and maybe a little better, I hope so, today than I was then. But I did not harbor the kind of animosities and race-based discrimination ideas that I was accused of. I did not.
So he was hoping that his record might be improved somehow by this hearing. What would you say, Barbara, after watching the hours of this hearing take place?
Well, he's been given plenty of chance to defend his record, as well as plenty of chance to explain his contentious votes. And one of those was regards to the issue of Muslims being banned from the country. You remember that Mr. Trump, during his campaign, proposed having this temporary ban on Muslims. He stepped back from that later. But when the Democrats tried to propose their own legislation in Congress, which would specifically say no one should be barred because of religious reasons, Mr. Sessions voted against that. So he was asked about it to explain himself. He said he did not support banning Muslims as a religion or banning any group as a religion, but he did want the freedom or the right to ban terrorists who might be inspired by their religion. And he spelled that out more fully in this exchange.
Would you support a law that says you can't come to America because you're a Muslim?
No.
Would you support a law that says that if you're a Muslim, you say you're a Muslim, and when we ask you, what does that mean to you? Well, that means I got to kill everybody that's different from me. It's okay to say they can't come.
I think that would be a prudent decision.
I hope we can keep people out of the country who want to kill everybody because of their religion. I hope we're smart enough to know that's not what most people in the Muslim faith believe. So,
but it can be the religion of that person.
That's right. That's the point we're trying to make here.
Well, Democrats don't have enough votes to block Mr. Sessions' nomination, but the quizzing and the tone of this hearing show just how concerned minorities in particular are about Mr. Sessions, the possibility of Mr. Sessions being Attorney General, and about a Trump presidency in general. And I think the Democrats will use the full 2 days that they have to continue pointing that out, Nuala.
Thanks very much, Barbara Pledusher. That session has just, 4 sessions has just broken for lunch. There'll be more taking place in the coming hours. Well, let's turn now to another part in the United States. President Obama, he is making his farewell address to the nation later in Chicago. He is expected to highlight his achievements abroad, the nuclear deal with Iran and the capture of Osama bin Laden. But he may be less forthcoming about the conflict in Syria, the rise of so-called Islamic State, and perhaps deteriorating relationships with both Russia and Israel, some say. So what is Obama's foreign policy legacy? Let's hear first from our North America editor, John Sopel.
There was always something upside down about Barack Obama receiving the Nobel Peace Prize before he'd really done anything as president. When he came to office, one of the greatest strategic threats was Iran, a resurgent power in the region. But more important than that was securing a multinational deal to curb Tehran's nuclear ambitions. An agreement struck despite fierce opposition from Israel's Prime Minister.
When Benjamin Netanyahu came to address the Congress nearly 2 years ago, there was fury in the White House. They were angry that an invitation had been extended by Republican leaders and accepted without the president knowing. But very soon, someone much more to the Israeli Prime Minister's liking will be occupying the White House. And the question the world is asking, will the Iran nuclear deal survive the change of power?
For over a year, we've been told that no deal is better than a bad deal. Well, this is a bad deal. It's a very bad deal.
His relationship with Netanyahu was one of the lows, culminating in the US refusing to veto a UN resolution critical of Israel's policy of settlement building. The chemistry with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was no better. Crimea, cyber espionage and Syria left them barely speaking. The pledge at the start of his presidency was all about disengaging from costly conflicts and bringing the troops back home.
We can say to those families who have lost loved ones to al-Qaeda's terror, justice has been done.
But the optimism brought by the successful raid to kill Osama bin Laden in 2011 and the spread of the Arab Spring would eventually be replaced by a Middle East in flames and the rise of so-called Islamic State, the fight against which remains unfinished business. Arguably, the low point for President Obama in the Middle East has been Syria, which has been a humanitarian catastrophe, sparking the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And the president's failure to act against President Assad, despite much huffing and puffing, has come back to haunt him.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
But nothing happened. No action.
I think it was a mistake not to enforce the red line. When the United States says very clearly that there will be costs and consequences for a certain action, I think it's important to follow up on that action. But I also wouldn't confuse that, enforcing the chemical weapons red line, with the notion that there was some interventionist fix to the Syria problem.
Barack Obama's policy towards Syria is very much like the country's embassy here in Washington, D.C. An empty shell, newspapers piling up on the doorstep, the windows barred. And in the talks to bring peace to the country, America isn't at the table. Barack Obama has flip-flopped over whether to take military action, too slow to react to the dangers of so-called Islamic State. It's been a period in which American influence has waned and Russian has increased. From one empty embassy to another that has had new life breathed into it. This is the Cuban embassy in northwest Washington. For over 50 years, it had lain derelict, a last legacy, if you like, of the Cold War.
In the warmth of a Caribbean island, Barack Obama consigned the last piece of icy Cold War legacy to history. Cuba had brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. Now diplomatic relations are restored, an extraordinary transformation. He leaves office largely admired and popular around the world, not least for his role in the global climate change deal. He tried to carve out a foreign policy that he saw as right for the times. But as the Commander-in-Chief was given the traditional send-off, in his own way, was he as destructive to US power and influence as his predecessor, George W. Bush? And what would the Nobel Committee make of him 8 years on? John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, let's turn to our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue joining us from the city of Chicago. Good to have you with us, Gary. That looks incredibly cold where you are. But tell me a little bit about the mood in the run-up to this farewell speech tonight.
Well, it's going to be a momentous occasion. I mean, an overused word, I know, but it really is, because it will mark, in a sense, President Obama's last chance to sum up really what he thinks he's achieved, to sort of bookend his presidency, to try and not just list his achievements as he sees it, but try and weave together those achievements into some sort of idea of how America has improved over the last 8 years, in his view, under his stewardship. So there'll be a lot about the economy, about the jobs. There'll be a lot about criminal justice reform, I'm sure. Of course, there'll be talk about his signature policy on healthcare reform. And there may well be an admission or two about what he'd like to have done that he didn't get done, such as comprehensive immigration reform and gun controls. What will be interesting, I think, is the extent to which he sort of sounds a warning bell about the future, about the risks he would perceive to all that from a Trump presidency. I'd be surprised if he did an all-out attack on Donald Trump. That wouldn't be very statesman-like. It wouldn't be very Obama-like, to be honest. But I wonder whether or not he'll try and warn America about the risks he sees going forward, because of course it's not just the sort of the consequences for those people out there if 20 million people were to lose their health insurance. It's his legacy that's at stake, and this is his big last platform to secure that legacy.
And is it just support that you're seeing for Obama in that city? I mean, it's interesting, his adopted hometown, but there have been, of course, so many disillusioned or disappointed Obama voters too.
Yes, there has. I mean, he leaves office with extraordinary approval ratings, 55, 57%. I mean, that's pretty good for an outgoing president after 8 years in power. Bill Clinton had something around that when he left, but it's really uncommon for that sort of level. I mean, his audience here tonight will be interesting because a lot of them will be Chicagoans, and of course, this city has been through some terrible times recently. Get this for a statistic, 762 people were murdered in this town last year. That's more than New York and LA put together. So there are still problems in America. There are still problems in President Obama's backyard, his adopted town. And people will feel that perhaps he could have done more to do something about that.
Really interesting, Gary. Thank you very much. We can understand why Chicago is called the Windy City. Stay warm. Thanks for coming on World News today. We're going to have more on the farewell speech, 2 GMT. Stay with BBC News for that. Now, some estimates say 3.5 million people turned out on the streets for the funeral of one of Iran's key post-revolution figures, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. It was the biggest show of force by the supporters of the reform movement for many years. Now, initially criticised for his harsh rule, he became a key reformist and has been buried today alongside the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. Janie Mitchell reports.
Prayers for one of the last major figures of the 1979 revolution, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, whose white cleric's turban was placed on the coffin. They were led by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who, despite their differences, has described Mr. Rafsanjani as his comrade and ally. At the supreme leader's side, the current moderate president Hassan Rouhani, who has now lost a key backer ahead of elections in May. Some estimates put the number of mourners paying their final respects at 3.5 million as the cortege made its way to his burial place. The tussle between moderates and hardliners was also felt on the streets. Some mourners held portraits of the former president. Others chanted the name of his even more reformist successor, Mohammad Khatami. State television responded by turning up the background music to drown out the chanting. In recent years, the media has been banned from publishing the name or images of Mr. Khatami, who was not present at the funeral. He'd called for supporters to come out in force to show their solidarity with the reform movement. Iran is holding 3 days of national mourning for the late Ayatollah Rafsanjani. Deep divisions over social and economic freedoms and further potential rapprochement with the West will remain. Janie Mitchell, BBC News.
Dozens of people have been killed in a succession of militant attacks in Afghanistan. The Taliban said it was responsible for the twin bomb attacks on an intelligence agency vehicle that was in the centre of Kabul. There's also been an explosion in the compound of the governor of the southern province of Kandahar. Up to 12 people were killed in that incident. Football's governing body, FIFA, has approved plans to expand the World Cup to 48 teams. It's going to open up the tournament to nations who have previously found it difficult to qualify, and it's set to boost the number of African and Asian countries that will take part. Now, this move will also generate millions more from advertising and TV rights. Let's hear more from our sports correspondent Richard Conway in Zurich.
FIFA has finally cleared a path to a World Cup of 48 teams. From 2026, 16 more countries will join football's flagship tournament.
We're all set up.
Speaking to me today, the world governing body's president insisted, in the face of much criticism, it's time for the sport to look beyond its traditional borders.
Football has now become a truly global game because many more countries, many more teams will have the chance to qualify. So they will invest in developing football, they will invest in developing elite football as well as grassroots football. They will invest in their technical developments, and this will make sure that the quality raises.
The growth of the World Cup will bring enormous extra revenue. FIFA stand to make an additional £500 million in profit in 2026, according to its own research. But the man elected as FIFA president, partly on a pledge to deliver a bigger competition, insists it's not about cash or politics.
Well, it's not at all a money and power grab. It's actually the opposite. It's a football decision. So the way we presented it was, okay, we presented 4 formats. Every one of the 4 formats has advantages in terms of the financial situation, which means that we are in a comfortable situation to be able to take a decision simply based on the sporting merit.
Asia, where interest in football is booming, and Africa stand to benefit the most when the extra 16 places are divided up. There will be more slots too for European nations. The Scottish FA welcomed today's decision, believing it will give them and others a better chance at qualifying. After a number of years when FIFA was a byword for corruption, its new leadership is determined to assert itself. Gianni Infantino's task is now to convince his critics a reformed World Cup is a force for good. Richard Conway, BBC News, Zurich.
Now to what was the scoop of the century, the news that Germany had invaded Poland, triggering the start of World War II. Well, today that British war correspondent who broke that story, Claire Hollingworth, has died at the age of 105. As a rookie reporter in Poland in 1939, she spotted German forces gathering on the border. Let's hear more from James Robbins, who looks back at her life and career.
This is the national programme from London. Germany has invaded Poland and has bombed many towns.
But 3 days earlier, Claire Hollingworth's greatest scoop had already appeared in the Daily Telegraph. Alone inside Germany, she'd seen the Nazis massing for invasion. Aged 27 and a journalist for less than a week, a woman in a man's world had beaten the lot of them.
1939, I went out to Poland to become number 2 to Hugh Carlton Green of BBC fame, and I got to Warsaw, and he said, one of us has got to go to the frontier, and I was on the German-Polish frontier when the German hordes tanks moved in.
Mr. Harold Philby on the
And Claire Hollingworth's scoops kept coming. In 1963, she uncovered Kim Philby's escape to Russia as an MI6 traitor. For weeks, The Guardian refused to publish, fearing a libel action. But above all, she was a war correspondent across the Middle East and notably in Vietnam, revealing secret talks between Hanoi and Washington.
I'm really passionately interested in war, and if one is passionately interested in war, one can't help like being in it.
Happy birthday, dear Claire.
Last year in Hong Kong, fellow journalists celebrated Claire's 105th birthday, as even more extraordinary stories emerged of her role before World War II, helping refugees escape the Nazis. In danger herself so many times, Claire Hollingworth was witness to great events across more than a century.
Well, let's speak to the writer and broadcaster Isabel Hilton, who knew Claire Hollingworth and was inspired by her work, as so many were. You're very welcome to the programme. Well, what a woman. Perhaps we could start with her significance.
Well, Claire was remarkable. She was a woman. She broke the biggest scoop of the century, as we've seen, and she was the most tenacious, dedicated reporter. She would never be noted for her fine writing, but there was no one like Claire for getting a story, and it's what she thought about all the time.
She was born in 1911. I mean, it's often a field that was difficult for women even in recent decades, but going back, she was 27 years of age when she broke that story.
She was, but if you look at the biography, you'll see that her father had insisted on sending her to domestic science college, which still makes me laugh, because anyone less inclined to domestic science than Claire, I have yet to meet. But anyway, she came from a kind of well-to-do, you know, rural family who thought that girls ought to learn a spot of cooking and get married. That was just not Claire's style, and she rebelled very quickly. She went off to work with refugees. She signed so many visas for refugees in 1938 that there were complaints from the British government about who was arriving. I mean, she was absolutely one of a kind, and she was fearless. She was remarkable.
You met her, and of course, Hong Kong, Asia, China, big parts of her life as well as yours. But with what was it that drove her, do you think?
I think she was absolutely dedicated to the craft of journalism. You know, she just, I remember I met her in Beijing when I was a student there, and we were the first batch of students to arrive, and there were very few foreigners in Beijing in those days, so we all knew each other, and Claire saw a bunch of new sources to cultivate, and she was, which she did with great style. You know, Lord Hartwell would like you to have a decent lunch, my dear, she would say, and off we would go to lunch. And she would grill us about what was going on in the university and bits of the China she couldn't access herself. And I remember her saying, you know, if I don't write a story every day, you know, I feel she felt uncomfortable. And in China in those days, it was very hard to practice journalism at all. You know, lots of places you couldn't go, there was very little access to sources. But she still, you know, a story a day was what she aimed for.
What about that, just as her legacy, a story a day? Isabel Hilton, thank you very much coming in and talking about some of the memories that you have of Claire Hollingworth. Well, to a reminder of our main news, it is that Jeff Sessions has been under confirmation hearings to be Attorney General. Stay with the BBC for that, but that's it from us for now. And actually, I can give you a few more details on Jeff Sessions. He was speaking, saying that he has never supported the Ku Klux Klan. There was a Democratic senator, actually, who expressed deep concern about the Alabama Republicans' nomination. The Democrats, you may know, do not have the power in the chamber to block his confirmation, but that doesn't actually put them off trying their best to bring up some of the issues that they feel should be front and centre when it comes to these confirmation hearings. And you're going to see a lot more coming up over the next few days, and of course all coming up before the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump on January 20th. And you can get in touch with me and lots of the team. I'm on Twitter, it's at BBC Nuala, and you can also see what we're working on via Facebook too, at facebook.com/BBC World News. Lots to look there about our programmes too, all coming up in the next few hours.